All right, everybody. This is the Equal Justice Podcast. My name's Anthony Costello. The Equal Justice Podcast is a forum for all those who seek truth, value tradition, and fight to defend the foundations of a moral and just society. I'm joined today with Jacob Daniel.
Hi, Tony.
And Logan Zeppieri. So,
hey, Tony.
And Josh is not with us today, but somebody has to actually do real work. So we'll let him do that. And we'll get on with a little bit more here, more in-depth discussion on critical race theory, especially in the Christian academy. So in the church, but especially now our focus is going to be on Christian universities and seminaries, evangelical ones at least. And we're going to be discussing two videos that were put out by the CCCU, which is the, Jacob, is it the congregation or the?
It's the Council of Christian Colleges.
Sorry, I don't know, I can't remember that. The Council of Christian Colleges and Universities. So one video was a panel discussion with several representatives or advocates of critical race theory. So these are all evangelical Christians who have been in the academy for a while or have also pastored, and we'll get to their names as we go through that video. But that video was put out by CCCU recently, and we'll provide the link so everybody can watch these for themselves. And again, those were 5 panelists, all very much advocating for teaching and embracing critical race theory as a very valuable tool for re-educating the church. At the same time, there's another video put out by CCCU, which was just an interview between Dr. Barry Corey, who is both a friend to some degree for all of us who went to Biola and Talbot. He is the president of Biola University, and he had an interview with David French, who I think most of our audience would know, a very, very well-regarded author and political commentator who has written for the National Review for many years and who has a new book out as well. And Jacob, what we noticed in, as we sort of juxtaposed both of these videos up against each other, is that there were some comments made in the interview between Dr. Barry Corey and David French that seemed to be in fundamental contradiction or disagreement, or were fundamentally incompatible with the views expressed by the other CCCU members on the critical race theory panel. So what I'll do here is I will reference these two comments. One was made by Barry Corey, the other is made by David French. And then we will take a look at the discussion on CRT by the 5 panel members. So at 23 minutes and 50 seconds of Dr. Barry Corey and David French's interview, Barry Corey says, and I quote, and he's referencing some of his own writings and the writings of David French when he says this. And Dr. Corey says, quote, that there are presuppositions of critical race theory, or CRT, that are fundamentally antithetical to the gospel, end quote. Okay? So there are presuppositions of CRT that are fundamentally antithetical to the gospel, and he's referencing things that David French himself has written about critical race theory. The second thing that was mentioned was by David French, who towards the end of the same interview says of CCCU universities, quote, that they have done by and large a pretty good job of cultivating an atmosphere of real debate and disagreement and dialogue, end quote. So David French, who has been at the forefront of many battles on freedom of speech, especially in secular circles and secular campuses. I think he mentions in the interview that his role with FIRE, which is the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, which has now been taken over by Greg Lukianoff, who's a non-believer, but very much an advocate for free speech, especially in universities and colleges. So David French seems to think that the CCCU has done a very good job, or at least by and large a good job, of cultivating debate, disagreement, and dialogue. But then Jacob, when we watched through several times, I think I've watched it through it twice, and I know you guys have taken copious notes on the panel discussion with Dr. Corey Edwards, Dr. Nathan Cartagena, Jeff Liu, Raymond Chang, and Romero. I forget Mr. Romero's first name. I think they would disagree with both of those statements. Very strongly disagree with Barry Corey's statement about CRT being fundamentally antithetical to the gospel. Yeah. And also they would disagree with David French's statement that the CCCU has, quote, done by and large a good job of promoting debate and dialogue. So maybe I'll hand it over to you at this point. What did you see in that panel discussion that was problematic with regards to what Barry Corey and David French were saying in their interview?
Thanks, Tony. And let me first of all say that I kind of enjoyed watching both videos and kind of saw a clash between two in some sense. And 2 points that you raised about, from the very beginning, it was very much obvious in the discussion, especially in the panel, that they unanimously, in some sense, because everyone was noting on this fact that, and this was raised by both Robert Romero as well as Corey Edwards. Both of them kind of like made it very, they were very vocal in terms of the fact that CRT is in line with the gospel message. And they said that they at least gave this impression that there is absolutely nothing threatening to the task of gospel when it comes to engaging with critical race theory. And the other was that among the panelists, it was very obvious that they were making a claim that CCCU have not done a good job in terms of appointing faculties, in terms of all these appointments where they have somehow disregarded the fact that, or somehow excluded those who would somehow raise concerns about racism, which seems to be kind of antithetical to these statements that you read, and something that is concerning and needs to be discussed. And that's why I think we all got together and having this discussion here to highlight that. But let me also say this. This conference where they were invited to speak, it's on leadership, Christian leadership. And there were some people that I personally know of who went and attended these conferences. And at the end, they were left confused as to why was it directed one way. And as both Barry Corey and David French are arguing that we need to have the space of discussion and win some approach, win some conviction about these things, why was it that this conference was just directed to one way, where they were clearly affirming critical race theory and pushing it as a tool for evangelism?
Well, Logan, that brings up the question, which let me frame it this way. One of the concerns, I think, that now Raymond Chang starts off that panel discussion saying that, you know, we need to move beyond this beginner level understanding of CRT. And certainly there's always going to be beginner levels of understanding CRT. You've got to start somewhere. It's not that old of a theory. It only goes back to the 1980s, roughly. You know, and I think, to Dr. Cartagena's credit, he is trying to sort of tease apart the various strands and forms and traditions of critical race theory, to the point of where, when you listen to him, there's a reason why it's hard to move beyond the beginning, a beginning level understanding of CRT, because it's incredibly complicated, convoluted, and as he points out, there's various traditions in CRT that themselves are incompatible with one another.
Even without having no definition for racism.
Well,
right.
I mean, this is where we referred into previous podcast episodes. If you look at the definitions, or at least the dispositions of a lot of those scholars, there's no objective viewpoint. So I don't think you can come to a consensus of what is racism, what is white supremacy, what is systemic racism, because to have an objective definition or a definition that all can agree on, you'd have to be able to point to something that you could say, well, actually, that's an incorrect definition of racism, which would require something that transcends just the individual, like theory producer, if it's the individual or maybe the university or whatever academic, enclave.
So what it seems then is you have a very ambiguous, ill-defined theory, yet it's being pushed somehow without allowance for any real criticism of it, which to me just seems fundamentally unwise and if not dangerous. So you have all the people who on the panel who want to embrace some version of critical race theory. They say they're making it sound like it really is the key to revitalizing the church and evangelizing even the lost now. Yet at the end of the day, when you listen to the panel discussions or the leadership conferences, you walk away still scratching your head as to what it is. And then, but to offer criticism or pushback is sort of just frowned upon as unacceptable. Or if we go full Robin DiAngelo, is evidence itself that you need to accept the theories, right? So to disagree is to show that you're part of the problem, and you need to, which also came up throughout the panel discussion, that this sense of people who are criticizing critical race theorists or theories are doing it only because they are entrenched and in their positions that are not grounded in truth, right, or falsehood, but are grounded in, again, the old canard we would say of wanting to maintain their own power, prestige, and position.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, and I mean, if you so they the battle of definitions is, I think, inextricably linked to a point that I think was extremely valuable made by David French and Barry Corey, and that is recapturing the inherent value of freedom of speech. Now, when people hear that, they think more of a watered down or maybe a mainstream media definition of freedom of speech, which is something like you can say whatever you want. Historically, though, the argument has been, you can go back, I think John Stuart Mill does a good job defending the right to freedom of the press, and therefore by extension free speech, as inherently valuable because it produces the context by which conflict and public persuasion refine particular ideas. This goes, if you look in the sciences, if you look natural science, especially biology, where they talk about the work done on like anti-fragile systems, or the importance of the immune system fighting itself, psychological arguments that are being made that you can't really have safe spaces and hope that the production of the psyche will be resilient to just the forces that happen within civilization. You see that same argument being made for freedom of speech. If you don't have the freedom of speech, you can't have the necessary refinement through conflict to produce better ideas. And J.S. Mill makes the argument that the consequence that some bad ideas or that the public square can become vicious is not as problematic or is not as great as harm as the benefits of producing those great ideas and those wise people. When you look at the conflict in CRT to even come up with a definition of what racism is, you actually see entrenched within its theory and its axioms of its theory, there is no value for the freedom of speech. It's whatever you have come to believe racism to be through personal lived experience or through the system of theories that you've developed that you're kind of throwing under the umbrella of critical race theory. So I think that's one way in which is very evident of a disagreement, is just the value of freedom of speech.
Okay. And just to add to that, Logan, and you articulated it so well, and I think I would say that with CRT, the danger is that we might even remove that objective standard or moral framework, even if we allow for free speech, freedom of speech. Will there be a freedom after the speech? That's an important aspect as well, right? It's not just freedom of speech, but also how do we sustain a collective enterprise with a moral framework that also allow freedom after you have spoken, whatever you have spoken.
Well,
And I think,
right, and that's a point that David French brought up in when he was talking about his own career, where he felt that at his very conservative undergrad university, Lipscomb, there was all kinds of freedom of speech. They could say whatever, they could deal with whatever issues. But then when he got to Harvard, he would get like death threats in his mailbox, which is like he was okay. So he obviously spoke something.
Well, he did correct
Yeah.
himself. Not death threats; they were
But,
death aspirations.
Death aspirations, like why don't you just go die, right?
Yeah.
But where he would obviously but to Jacob's point, he was able to say what he wanted to say at Harvard, but what came after was anything but tolerant, right, of him as a person. So before we continue on the free speech, so this is part of where we saw some disagreement between the two videos, though, because it is the claim of the panelists, the CRT panelists, that it's their voices or voices of people that they want to see in positions of power and authority. And those were basically Corey Edwards' almost exact words, positions of power and authority in the academy here, at least, if not in the rest of the culture. But it's voices of CRT advocates that have been stomped out, apparently, by CCCU universities. Now, of course, no concrete examples were given, maybe for legal reasons, but there did seem to be some general allegations made by several of the panelists along this lines of people in the CCCU have been excluded. They have not been heard. They have not had their individual rights upheld, right, to speak freely. Now, those are some pretty bold claims. I don't know what your guys' take on those were, but mine were, if you make those claims, you really need to back those kinds of claims up with concrete evidence and arguments.
mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And
Well, I think that was.
Go ahead.
Well, I think that was very common within that panel interview when they did bring up stories. It's did the stories connect with the particular definition they're trying to illuminate? For example, they say, oh, there was this racist episode that happened. This individual was very poor, had contracted HIV from the hospital, had a difficulty getting immigration papers through. What's difficult for me to understand, as tragic as it could be, as it is, or even not with the insufficient evidence to really know what happened, he's somehow connecting the original point, which is about racism, to a particular medical, maybe malpractice, I don't know. There was enough evidence in the story about contracting HIV, which then somehow connected to immigration status, which he didn't make the connection of how did it even resolve. And so I think what happens, and you saw the host of the panel, or I guess the moderator, do is just affirmed the story, because I think there's this idea that if you don't affirm the story, if you say, well, could you tell me what you mean by that? Can you explain a little further how that connection is being made? Somehow you're being unsympathetic. Somehow you're not hearing out the other individual. It's like, well, no, part of hearing out someone is knowing all the facts of what happened, knowing how they're connecting their experiences to those facts. How do you because it builds the foundation of how you even resolve the problem.
Yeah,
well,
I think you raised an important point there. Actually, this is something we should be careful about, and especially Christians as well. When we have a discussion of this kind, we should have that freedom to actually question the narratives that people bring in. There is somehow this understanding in group discussions now, especially around CRT, that you have to affirm all stories, regardless of them not having any logical basis of connection, as you pointed out. And that's also because of the very mood of this theory in terms of affirming all stories that you bring around racism and around critical race theory. And there is no basis, objective framework within which they can bring and question the very basis of those stories that they bring. So that's an important point that you raised, Logan.
But even with the logic basis, just really quick on Jacob, even the logic basis, given some of the stories, there's not even enough of the story to know if it is or is not grounded in any form of logic or evidential. It may very well be.
Yeah.
But our rush to affirm whatever anyone says actually short circuits any sort of valuable conversation. You have to be able to ask questions. Go, okay, how did you come to that conclusion? Why did you come to that conclusion? What's implied by that conclusion? That's just kind of the repertoire from Kokel's Tactics, which is just, a great little thing to remember. But the fundamentals of a valuable conversation, this goes back to when you don't allow for an objective perspective of any kind. And I think this isn't so much a critique of CRT as just acknowledging where I think they're in fact right. Once you get away from things like objective definitions, or that things can be critiqued from any form of objective worldview, what replaces that? How are ideas promulgated if it's not for the search of the objective truth? It's power dynamics. So I think that's where CRT is right, is once you get rid of the objective perspective, it is reduced to power dynamics. That's the only thing controlling the promulgation of ideas.
And in the other video that we saw with Barry Corey and David French, I think they would side with us on that, and they also affirm that we shouldn't be rushing into any kind of conclusions, but engage with these ideas. So
let's stick. I want to stick on this story that Robert Romero?
Robert Romero, yes,
yeah,
told, because I do think it is illustrative of the way we do things these days. And I mean, it like Logan said, maybe the people at the hospital or the immigration office were actually racist. They did not want this, and it seems to be that it would have been it was a Hispanic woman who had this blood transfusion and contracted HIV. I mean, the first thing any lawyer is going to ask is just, for the absolute facts of whether or not the transfusion was actually the cause of the HIV. But we're going to grant all that because this is a pastor, so we know he's telling the truth on these things. But it could be that he's saying, well, it wasn't that the people were racist who were, giving her pushback because she had HIV. Okay, where she had to write this letter. And I have to say, I didn't really believe this part about her having to write a letter apologizing for having HIV. I don't know really that
I didn't connect that as well.
Maybe she did that, but I don't see that being a requirement.
I don't see that being forced upon her to, like, hey, write a letter apologizing that you have a disease.
I mean, we may have to understand.
Stretches credulity.
Yeah, we may have to understand the context, but
right.
I kind of concerned with like immigration requirements and things like that. One is not required to actually justify their condition.
Right. Well, and Jacob, you've been through this process, so
yeah.
I mean, but again, there's a lot to affirm with these panelists too, and we're not in total disagreement. And although I probably shouldn't have to say this, but these are all very well read, very well educated, thoughtful people.
Yes.
I mean, should go without saying, but you just listen to them. We know that. But it could be that Robert Romero was saying that the poverty, again, because the definition of the way critical race theorists would frame the question of race is, it's in the system. So the fact that she's in these conditions to begin with, that's the racist part. Not that anybody actually treated her as inferior. Just the fact that you have a Mexican American or maybe some kind of Hispanic American in conditions of poverty, that's the racism. How do we solve that? But of course, what I think falls out sometimes in these issues of just the systemic part is, I see two things happening throughout the discussion: the systemic and what I call simple racism, which is just somebody believing that they are superior to another in virtue of their ethnic distinctions. They keep getting conflated. We keep going back to, over and over again, forgetting about the systemic part because it's very abstract, and then just saying, well, let's have better relationships, which is really just working on the problem of not having simple racism in the culture.
I think they've done that time and again. I mean, they justified critical race theory by condemning individualized racism. they
Yeah.
mentioned that, right? So
Right.
As a Christian, we should be understanding how is that even possible? Given that you agree with systemic racism, can you do that? Can you uphold systemic racism at the expense of individualized racism?
Right.
You know,
And
why is it that we are able to pick and choose whenever we want to?
right. Well, and what I was saying is, so if the interpretation is that what was racist was just the fact itself that this just young woman was in a condition of poverty where she couldn't get a good lawyer, etc. Okay, that seems to run up against what Glenn Lowry has called the bias theory. You know, where, well, I shouldn't say that. What it does, though, and this is the point, that it could run up against that, because Lowry has the development theory and the bias theory. Because what we don't know is anything about this girl's family. Are the parents together? You know, is there divorce? All these other factors that contribute to poverty that have nothing to do with race, right? Versus what Lowry calls the bias theory, which is when there are discrepancies in socioeconomic status, education levels, it just gets chalked up to racial bias. See, and I think that story illustrates where we don't know, but it seemed to me like saying that the real problem here was poverty, but because she was in poverty, it must have been because of racial factors. But we don't know that. It could have been all kinds of other factors that put that person or any other minority into conditions of poverty. And then the question now is, are we going to address these other factors of poverty or not?
Well, and this goes back to our previous podcast that we were talking about,
right?
Where I think that if you adopt critical race theory, you have to acknowledge that you're dropping, by the dictates of its own, the axioms of its own theory, these other factors. So I don't know if critical race theory would say, oh, among all these possible factors, we just value race over the other ones. I think part and parcel of the theory is that fundamentally all factors have to be funneled through the lens of racism. So these other factors you mentioned that could contribute to poverty aren't being devalued within the theory. They're just being dismissed out of hand from the theory because those aren't factors that are relevant to the theory. So you're actually losing those factors out in your analysis, which I think should be brought up. It's, you know, if you're going to prop up CRT as the solution of racism, what you're saying is there's no other factors out there that could describe that, which is a very bold claim, especially in the social sciences.
So now let's that's right. And now let me try and defend the CRT panelists or try and maybe not steel man their arguments, but where they would push back and say, but it's the ideas, right? It's the ideas that developed in around the 15th and 16th century. Nathan Cartagena goes through more of the historical lineage of racism in America, and not just in America, but it's the ideas of Enlightenment, European colonial Enlightenment thought, where Europeans just, I guess, tend to be biologically more light-skinned than others. So you can call it way. I mean, part of my contention here, and I brought this up before, if we would drop the language of whiteness, where people immediately think of like their actual skin color, and just talk about, European culture in the Enlightenment era and how maybe that overlays some of our interpretations of the scriptures or our governmental structures, fine. I think we could deflate a lot of the conflict there. But Nathan goes back and does some of the historical work. And then, him and Corey Edwards would say, look, there's these ideas that were coupled together with race that themselves then were from the beginning fundamentally geared towards creating legal institutions, other kinds of academic institutions for whites only. Okay. And it's these features of European colonialism that we have to divest or excise from all of our institutions. Right. Now, what these features are sometimes gets tricky to, point out concretely.
Mm-hmm.
I would jump in and just ask one question, especially to Nathan, which will be, why is it that he only pointed to 1440? I think that's, and in terms of the Portuguese
Right.
invasion and Latin America and the examples that he'd been giving. How would he respond to, say, if we read Numbers chapter 12, right? Miriam and Aaron confronting Moses of him marrying a Cushite. Why not we just go all the way back there and just, so what I'm saying is that there is a disconnect in terms of history and picking and choosing and pointing to just one document or one analysis of history at a particular time, not going all the way back and engaging with cultures around the world, where if you bring in within the Indian context, this idea of fair skin was not merely the product of the British invasion or the Portuguese invasion or the French invasion. It's been there ingrained within the Indian psyche itself from the very beginning. If you see, the very emergence of caste system was in many ways on the basis of this color or difference between people, right? So how is it that we can actually pinpoint to just this one historical fact and claim that what we are witnessing today in terms of racism is informed merely by these ideas that's being pushed around that time?
Wow, that's interesting. So, I mean, one contention there is, hey, look, this idea of pigmentocracies is not something that started in 1444 with some Portuguese seafarer. It's more of a universal phenomenon.
It is,
Yeah.
and that's been happening time and again. And I'm also saying that in the discussion, there is an attempt to distance from the very origins of this idea of CRT, which is being limited just to 1980s. That's not the case. We have to find, even because they condemn the very ideas of Enlightenment and its connection with Protestant movement and things like that. Whereas we need to be also connecting the very ideas of CRT to its very early origins in terms of, I would even point to cultural Marxism that they're trying to actually distance themselves from.
Yeah, well, there's a few things when Nathan brought this up, where he says something like it was the 1801 1800s Naturalization Act. There's the
1790 naturalization.
1790, yeah. Sorry, 1790. Because he wants to connect the what's going on in Portugal, the things that go on in the United States, and says, see, it was just a society built by white people for white people at the exclusion of black people. And I think there's a few things. You guys hit the first one that need to be taken into consideration that I think Nathan, at least in the panel interview, I will read through some of his other work to see it. And there's a book forthcoming on his end. Maybe he'll explore this a little bit more. But he seems to miss a few things. The first one is, as you just mentioned, that the idea that you're going to separate people by the color of the skin is not an inherently Portugal situation. This is not where it started. You can look at the slave trade in Africa. The Wall Street Journal just posted that article about the sort of racism that was going on in Africa and the tribal warfare that led to slavery, that led to them selling to the Europeans on the coast of Africa. Sometimes we get this idea that Europe just invaded Africa, stole a bunch of people and left, when in fact most of the time, and the Wall Street Journal seems like it was a general rule that the Europeans stayed on the coast and the African tribes were the ones stealing each other and selling them off. So you have this, as you said, with the caste system. So it's not just a European phenomena. It's more the general rule when you look at the last 10,000 years of human history. Slavery was the rule, it seemed like. And second, it seems, and I don't think this is a huge jump, but that when discrimination did arise, it was always against someone not like you. I think the existentialists bring this up about a bad conscience and the, persecuting the self. But when it comes by and large, culturally speaking, if a culture is going to become biased against someone, it's usually against another society, and they're going to pick something that makes them different.
That they can exaggerate then.
Exaggerate,
to
easy to point out, to
right.
justify.
Yeah.
And so you have the general rule, you have kind of this natural phenomenon within human cultures that if they're going to, this is going to happen. And then you have, they really hit hard at the Enlightenment But I think what they fail to at least give a fair hearing to is, if there's the general rule to discriminate against cultures and the general rule that slavery is okay, what does fighting against that actually look like? And this is where he cites one naturalization law that was passed and says, there it is, it was fully established. And he ignores everything else that had been said or done. He ignores Jefferson's first draft of the Declaration of Independence, where he explicitly condemns racism and says one of the reasons why we're fighting against Britain is because the Christian king, has supported the buying and selling of human beings, and this is not okay. He ignores the path of abolishing the slave trade, eventually making it a capital offense. He ignores the House of Representatives in the state of New York condemning slavery because of the principles of the American Revolution. He ignores Abraham Lincoln going back to the Declaration of Independence, saying we put the seeds to abolish slavery from the founding document. He ignores the Northwest Ordinance, which made slavery illegal in the Western territory, which ultimately became the states that formed with the Northeastern original colonies. The core alliance that would produce the Union and abolish slavery. He ignores, like, in his description of white supremacy, the Civil War makes no sense. Why would a white system for white people in the oppression of others decide to kill a bunch of white people to set them free? It makes no sense. And I got a little upset listening to him say that, because it's just ignoring so much history. And the original writings, Jefferson's very extensive on condemning Washington, Madison,
and I think that's
Benjamin
where we would
Rush.
expect Logan, then in his book treatment of this subject, there'll be a more nuanced articulation of these complexities, because certainly on the panel discussion, it was a pretty one-sided affair, of a pretty one-sided sort of telling of history. I mean, speaking of one telling, and you both mentioned this now, but and Logan, I think it's in the current edition of Touchstone that R.V. Young wrote an article called Owning Slavery. I don't have it in front of me. But again, where he talks about everybody owning up to slavery. And he does talk about, this sort of canard that's in the culture that, like, the Portuguese conquered Africa or something and just started rounding up women and children, which, it would be refreshing, I think, to hear some advocates of CRT also at least give the more complex nature of the slave trade, as well as all of the African tribes that were involved in that. But that seems to be intentionally and selectively left out, right? Because it takes away from the emotional, I think, power of the sort of the narrative that Nathan gave in the talk. It diminishes your rhetorical force if you also have to start incorporating the horrible things that people of color have done to each other. And we see that done in discussions on the conditions of our urban Black communities, where the whole discussion of the amount of gang and gun violence in the big cities in America where the predominantly Black areas of them just falls out of discussion, right? Yep. Because we don't want to talk about that because it doesn't fit this other narrative that we're pushing that, is the means to our ends, right? Whatever those ends might be.
Yeah. I mean, when you can't take on the nuance and complex nature of something, it's not to justify the slave trade, it's not to justify the atrocities that did take place, but if you can't capture the complexity of the situation, the solution more often than not is damaging, because you're not taking into consideration of questions like, how do you take something that is by and large the rule that you know is morally wrong, and the founding fathers of the United States wrote extensively on this, that it was morally wrong. How do you change society without imposing kind of a top-down authoritarian government to make it happen? You saw this try to take place soon after the American Revolution in France, ended up decapitating a bunch of people. I mean, there were attempts, and the question is, how do you affect prudential social change? And if you can't capture the complexity of the situation, how it happened, you're not going to understand why it was as difficult as it was.
I was listening to the radio today. Dennis Prager. There was this shooting in Georgia yesterday. I think 8 people were killed in a mass shooting.
Mm-hmm.
And, as to now, there's no explanation. We don't know. And Prager, posed this question of, is there something worse than having no explanation for an atrocity or an incident? And his answer was yes. A wrong explanation
exactly.
is worse.
Yep.
Right. And again, and it's we're trying don't want to dismiss everything that any of the panelists are saying. There are things to be gleaned here, especially just the history of racism, the particular racism in America. I mean, I do feel like, and I think Nathan even mentioned that, a lot of the philosophers here I felt there was a fallacy made. He says, there's all of these philosophers, Enlightenment philosophers that we read in school, Hume, Voltaire, Montesquieu, Mill, and he says Mill and Marx, Herder and Hegel were others that he mentioned, who were all had some explicit things to say about the inferiority of blacks, especially, and Kant as well. What I didn't understand was, but I've never heard any philosophy professor advocate. Now, I think what he's saying is you can't. It almost is like I said, you can't take any of those philosophers' thinking as true because they wrote some things that were racist. I mean, as a philosopher, I hope he's not saying that, but it was a little unclear to me because I mean, most of these thinkers were not Christians anyway, so we're rejecting them on other grounds.
Yeah,
and we're rejecting them with skepticism or whatever.
Well, this goes into something I think what you see developing and kind of the United States at the time, reading works like I think it's Benjamin Rush, Thomas Jefferson. Lincoln picks this up in the Lincoln-Douglas debates where he says, right, because Benjamin Franklin, they all write on this. They're like, do we know, and this is a question they're asking, that blacks are inferior to white? That's a question that's on the table. They're trying to debate it out. But they come to an interesting conclusion, which Lincoln picks up. And the conclusion is, so what? Imagine if we'll just grant the argument, we don't need to investigate it. Are you saying someone has a right to enslave someone because they're intellectually inferior? If that's the case, this is what Lincoln says, then be careful of the next smart person that walks by you because now he has a moral justification to enslave you. I think Jefferson refers, or Rush refers to Isaac Newton. Says, be careful when Isaac Newton is around because then he can put you into slavery. So the argument shifts very quickly. The Pennsylvania state legislature picks this up and says, we don't know why God made people differently. All we do know is that they're all made by God. And they kind of cut the debate at a metaphysical level, which is I think what we're trying to capture is everyone has inherent, fundamental, equal human value. Yeah. And now I think we have better science to be able to justify this, but when you're going back to the 1700s and the debates emerging, I think they'd make the right step in going, and despite the sufficient evidence and whatever that may be, we have the metaphysical grounds to make the case close today. And that is, no, we have equal fundamental human value. And that's the end of the story.
Yeah, exactly. And I think this is the very idea of fundamental intrinsic worth of individuals on the fact that as Christians, we believe we all are made in the image of God. That allows for, Tony and I, we were talking about this a while ago, the very idea of unity in diversity, right? The very idea that we acknowledge that there is diversity, but in the midst of that, we look for that unity. Whereas what I'm seeing with CRT is that there is an attempt to actually create diversity in unity.
Out of unity. Yeah.
Out of unity.
Yeah.
Right. There is this intentional effort to basically divide people on the basis of their kind of affinity to group, affinity to this collective existence that they create, or identity that create on the basis of the tribe or the group they belong to, and then attempt to actually justify, their longings or their presence in that collective. So I think during the discussion itself, there've been too much of emphasis in terms of the very idea of collectivism, right? And at the end, Nathan does talk about three areas where people who actually critique CRT feel threatened by. One is that there is no one Christianity, that there's an emerging Christianity that we need to appeal to. The other is that we need to actually, it is seen as a threat to nuclear family and then to individual meritocracy.
Right.
And there was no way that they actually mentioned or specified as to why these things are inherently bad, or why should these things be inherently white in its nature. Or what about the fact that there are other communities, other people, other cultures who would also aspire to these values and not see them as being white inherently?
Well, this is one of the biggest. I mean, when it getting down back more to the theological issues, okay, and those were the three things that I could identify as concrete concepts or concrete ideas that were put on the table as features of infected or diseased Christianity. And in order to heal Christianity from this disease of whiteness or white supremacy, as Corey Edwards says, you know, we had to excise Christianity of Eurocentric post-Enlightenment colonial culture. And then you say, okay, but what features of that culture need to be identified so that they can be extracted? And the only thing I heard was that it was the nuclear family, meritocracy, and individualism. Now, first I'd say, and Jeff Liu even said, like, he said, if you take out nuclear family, meritocracy, and individualism, he basically kind of said, well, that's not the gospel. So if you're critiquing those things, right, you're not, so those things aren't part of the gospel. So if you're critiquing CRT because you think CRT is going after those things, then you are not upholding the gospel, because those aren't gospel values, or those aren't biblical concepts, nuclear family, meritocracy, and individualism. I want to say a couple things there. One is, I think the nuclear family is, and I don't think that has anything to do with whiteness. I don't think that has anything to do with post-15th century pigmentocracies developed in Europe that somehow infected Christianity. But the nuclear family, that's one that, again, when we look out at the culture, we keep seeing the nuclear family under attack by secular critical race theorists. And again, it always gets connected to the sexuality issues. Now, meritocracy and individualism, well, I would say nobody's talking about meritocracy with regards to salvation, right? This is sort of more meritocracy with sort of how to have a healthy, stable society. I mean, what's the answer to meritocracy? Nepotism? Okay, because that's what it was before. I mean, he doesn't really say, like Jacob said, he doesn't say, just says meritocracy is a problem. I don't think meritocracy, I think if you were to look at feudal Japanese society, I don't think that meritocracy is like not in some way, shape, or form part of 17th century Japanese feudal society. I'm sure it is. And then with regards to individualism, look, of course, but everybody's been wrestling with that. I don't think that white European theologians, I'm sure I could produce something by John Calvin right now if I went up to the institutes where he would talk about the problem of individualism in his day. I mean, that's just like not, I mean, that's like obvious that individualism or some kind of expressive individualism or an emphasis on the individual to the detriment of the community. Like, I don't know why that's controversial. Like, everybody knows that.
And I think there's a complete disregard for the fact that majority of the world today, even those that have not been directly impacted by the Western world, have evolved into meritocratic societies, have evolved into an individualistic society, have evolved into,
not just through the force of the British Empire, Jacob.
Not necessarily, not necessarily, right? I mean, values have been adopted from outside, but there's no way to claim that these societies have evolved, particularly because of the direct impact of these ideas. But they adopted it because they wanted to, they saw the good in it. And even if you see the very Chinese society, which we can know was not much impacted as much as some of the other nations around the world of the Western, imperialism. It has evolved into one of the most meritocratic societies in the world today, in terms of how it engages with, economics or whatever it may be.
Maybe we need to convince China that they should drop meritocracy. It might be better for all of us.
Well, I think there's something that's fair in CRT about its attack on meritocracy, but I think what's unfair is they think that the critique is unique to CRT. I'm reading through the Consolation of Philosophy by Boethius, so I think it's like 1400, something like that. It's the medieval period. It's pretty old.
900.
900. Okay. So
maybe even earlier than that.
Yeah.
Pre-white.
Anyway.
It's pre-white. Don't use
it. It's pretty. I mean,
pre-white.
580.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we're looking quite a long time ago. I think he does. It's probably one of the best and most simple critiques of not necessarily meritocracy, but the consolation individual a man has to come into with this concept of fortune, which I think is probably a great critique, that there's a good portion of your life you're going to get that is undeserved. Some of it's going to be really good, and some of it's going to be really bad. You see this idea pushed through the Enlightenment, you have Hayek in his book, The Mirage of Social Justice, where he's talking about, this pure meritocracy view, which is that people only get what they deserve, is not correct. This goes down to even like the disciples of Christ. Is this guy is blind? Whatever his ailment was it because his father sinned? He said, no, that's not why that happened.
Yep.
So there's been a natural inclination to say either people get ultimately what they deserve, or that they ultimately don't get what they deserve. But there has this been balancing critique for a very long time that, well, it seems like some good people have bad things happen to them and some bad people have good things happen to them, and vice versa. It's not. So I do agree that the people who ultimately view that everyone ultimately gets what they deserve, I think is not entirely accurate, especially in this life. Maybe in the next life that ends up being true. But I don't think that's unique to CRT. And I think they're short selling the Enlightenment, and they're short selling a lot of what happened after the Enlightenment when they start critiquing meritocracy. And I think Hayek is probably one of the most libertarian economists you can find. So it's not even like, certain sections of this, like what you imagine to be the radical view of meritocracy, this libertarianism, is like, no, it seems like that's not true either.
Well, going back, that's good, Logan. That there was something about going back to the theological, some of the theological issues that Jeff Liu brought up, and Corey Edwards, where again, a few yellow flags at least popped up. And to both Jeff Liu and Corey Edwards' credit, their presentation and approach seems very pastoral, and their concern certainly seems to, well, Corey Edwards said herself, so that we stop damaging people's souls. So I mean, there's certainly some kind of rallying cry here, apparently, to make sure we're doing good pastoral work, caring for people's souls, their emotional and mental well-being. I do feel that, again, throughout the underlying analysis, however, continues to get reduced down to material goods, positions of power, and potentially even just money. There's not a lot of talk about the transcendent whenever we hear from CRT advocates. It doesn't seem to be the focus. It's very incarnational is the word that is often used. God is, of course, the God-man Jesus, who, took on the body of a poor Jewish, backwaters Galilean. And of course, we're all affirming that. But I'm just saying the transcendent does seem to get lost a lot of the times here. And oftentimes when we appeal to the transcendent, the pushback is sort of that's kind of not important, or that's a way to ignore the real issues. And this is something that a colleague of ours at Biola told me once in a private discussion, that when he goes back and forth with some people who are very open or who want CRT, who embrace CRT, they really do tend to brush aside, the transcendence of God. And, would probably maybe wouldn't consider, like Paul sending Onesimus back to Philemon. Like, they would just say Paul was wrong. Like, Paul was wrong. He shouldn't have sent Onesimus back. He should have told Onesimus to run away, Okay. But the other thing, the thing here that I worry about sometimes is when we talk about, because this term was brought up both by Jeff Liu and Corey Edwards, of contextual theology. And this was one of the things where it was said that those of us who do contextual theology, we've been excluded, which again, I can only see, to me, I think what they're saying is people have either been fired from their jobs, or if they've specifically not been hired because they do contextual theology or they bring in other theologies. And this is where I would reference our audience back to my discussion with Ed Echeverria, who's a Roman Catholic systematic theologian. The difference between contextual theology and correlation theology is that it's not much. And contextual theology, I think one of the problems is, or where the fine lines is, when you cross over from doing contextual theology, which of course all theology is contextual, we get it. But when you move into a correlation mode of doing theology, or a dialogical method of doing theology, and this is the problem of historicism, well, then the Bible really becomes malleable in your hands. And we really start losing anything, both metaphysical or moral, that could bind us together as a body of Christ. Because now everybody has their own theologies. And in having their own theologies, they have their own metaphysics, they have their own morals, because the Bible now is just a rubber nose that can be twisted and shaped in whichever direction the culture is going. And I think that's where I'd like to hear from critical race theorists, something like some explicit statement. We are not doing correlation theology. We are not, because Corey Edwards references James Cone. And look, it's not that we're saying you can't read James Cone or is it Gustavo Gutierrez, the liberation theologians from Latin America of the 70s, 80s, and 90s, the Roman Catholic ones. But it's like, if you accept that methodology, you're not doing contextual theology anymore. You're doing correlation theology. And then, as Raymond Chang kind of said, look, we believe in the sufficiency of the Bible. He did mention that once or twice. But I think it's a question on the table for some of these folks as to whether or not they really do believe in the inerrancy, infallibility, sufficiency and perspicuity of Scripture or not. Or if our deep-seated historical sense of wherever we're situated or located is ultimately going to determine for us what the Bible actually says. And so I would want more clarity from some of the panelists on that particular issue as well.
Yeah, I think so. One of the panelists, let me see, I think it's Corey Edwards. She was the one that made the comment that we're focusing on the individual. We're not focusing on the gospel. Now, I think this goes into a lot what you're saying, Tony. And I think when you look at the CRT theory and what some of the critical race theorists are advocating, you start seeing these, I don't know if I want to call them malformations. These are kind of the very inconsistent applications or wrestlings with certain problems. So for example, if you can't focus on the individual, or that focusing on the individual is not where we should be working, then how is it also possible that we have so many individualized definitions of race and racism? How do we have so many justification for so many individualized theologies? Why do we have question, why is there concern for the formation of the individual human soul? Like, why are these problems when those aren't, in their theory, the problems? So it seems like they're adding on either other things to the theory that's not explicit. So they could say something like, we shouldn't focus on the individual, but we should also be concerned with the human soul. How are those both being held onto?
Good point. Yeah.
Now, I think the people who attach human value to the individual has an argument for both why we should be concerned about racism, namely it's a violation of fundamental human value, and we can also be concerned about the formation of the human soul, because I think we have dropped that off within the last 20 or 30 years or however long, where the church really hasn't focused on the development of the individual soul and its relationship to God and to others in the community. But if the individual is not the focus, then how could you ever solve that problem?
Yeah.
It seems like it drops out unless you add something that's not being explicit to the theory.
I think we'll end up with some kind of reformer's dilemma here. If you see human history in terms of if the focus remains on the collective and the systemic as a source of salvation or reform, what happens is that then we'll have to abandon all the individuals who worked within a moral framework or appealed to a moral framework and brought about reforms in cultures, right? We have to do that. Throughout history, we talk about William Wilberforce, we talk about Gandhi, we talk about whoever it may be, Martin Luther King, right? They were individuals convicted by a certain moral framework and wanted to actually bring that to the collective. What are we going to do with that? Going to throw them away or just cancel them out? And
Right.
even in our, so it's not either or. I think we need to be concentrating on both and bringing about a biblical framework within that we all agree with, right?
Yeah.
While we are talking about contextualization, we are working with one theology that we can all appeal to and agree with, though we may bring our different contexts into it.
I imagine that none of the panelists would say that individualism, the kind of focus on the individual that led to something like the Universal Declaration for Human Rights, was a misguided focus, right? I mean, there are things to affirm here. I mean, Nathan mentioned like drawing on global theology. And I would say amen to that, right? I mean, this idea of going outside of just the Latin West, which is, another way of saying, I guess, white theology, but the Latin West, which is probably what we would have called it in the 15th or 16th century, Latin Western, Latin Christianity, and going more global. I mean, I think that is a fair point. Now, I mean, if we were I grew up Catholic, so I remember when we had the Nigerian priests come and give our sermons, we were, super enthusiastic about that because those guys seemed to be preaching and teaching a far more conservative and biblically faithful gospel than the white kind of liberal priests that we had normally. So like, I think there's this idea of like, if we look at global theologies from Africa or Asia, it's going to like overturn a lot of European, the theology that emerged out of Europe. Now, there may be a problem there if we say all of the sort of contemporary global theologies have been unduly influenced by colonialism, so they can't help but be white in some sense. But then I guess what we have to do is we just have to go back further and further in history, like Logan just mentioned Boethius, until we get to some kind of non-white theology. And I could say, okay, that might even be, that's certainly something to commend. Let's go back to the early church fathers. Let's go back to the medievals. If we can still use Aquinas, I don't know. I think he's pre-white. But, or if it's not the Latin West, you take Patriarch Timothy of Seleucia, who was like one of the most brilliant early medieval scholars in history. A lot of people aren't going to be familiar with him. So let's go back and read all those theologies. My guess is, though, that not much is going to be overturned, at least not in the way that some of our CRT friends think it will be. If you go back to more ancient historical theological treatises and documents. But I'm all for global theologies, but global theologies does not mean every theology is equally valid. Right?
And at the same time, there's one aspect of world missions and evangelism that is completely ignored in our discussion usually, is the fact that there are people around the world who are willing to adopt the good that they see on the other side, right? The rest of the world, how people do theology, it's not that they don't want to situate it within their own context. They definitely do want to do that. And I think they should do that. At the same time, they're open and willing. I've traveled quite a bit, been in different cultures around the world. There is this desire to actually be learning and to adopt things that they consider as good and better from other cultural contexts within their own, right? And no one talks about that. There is complete, and I think that's completely, in my opinion, a disregard for providing a place for truth to flourish. So when cultures are concerned with truth, guess what? That truth will look similar, whether it be here in the Western context or in the Eastern context or Latin context or wherever it may be. If the pursuit is for the truth, we have to agree with the fact that sometimes it might look similar, and we can't question and just call it as ethnocentrism or some sort of Eurocentrism or connected with precisely with some Eastern context and divide people on the basis of that. I don't think that will be more dangerous for the church. We should be, as I would agree with Barry Corey in that the idea of coming to the center with regards to truth will bring us to a place where we might look similar. We might be engaging with the same ideas while maintaining our differences as well at the same time.
Yeah, I'd have to watch it for a third time, but I don't think the word truth came up in the panel discussion.
And that would be the question I would,
yeah,
in response to what Jacob just said, I think what becomes a problem is the question for critical race theorists. Do they acknowledge any sense of objective or transcendent truth in the evaluation of the human condition?
Right. That even Europeans might have identified and applied to culture. Because, we talked about this in our review of Nathan's first essay, which those will come out later. But, what happens if you do divest Christianity or the government from certain cultural features that emerged out of Europe that you think, I guess, are just negative, right? I mean, are they replaced with ideas from some other ethnic culture? How do we know if those ideas are better? Will they cause their own subset of sociological problems, et cetera, et cetera? I mean, I think the more abstract we get away from simple racism, which is, the orientation of an actual person's heart towards another based on their skin color or something, the more we get into abstractions, the more difficult it becomes to discern what those features are embedded in the system, B, how to excise them from the system, and C, what to replace them with, because maybe you don't really know how to adjudicate them from a normative perspective. I mean, there might just be some really fine things about the Enlightenment that we really should keep. And if we replace them with some views from how Africans have traditionally run their governments and societies, that would be sociologically worse for everybody. Which, I think nepotism, for example, would be, a bad, I mean, Jacob, you've been in India. I don't know what's in India, but if we were going to go to a model of governance, the likes of what they have in the Pashtun culture in Afghanistan, it's nepotism.
It is very much in all sectors of influence, right?
Yeah.
Be it politics, be it business, be it education. Who do you find up there? You find upper caste Brahmins.
Yeah.
Majority of them, they are only minority in India. Majority of people are lower caste, but you find Brahmins up there just dictating how things are, right?
And I'll say this as a side note on nepotism.
And that's actually because of nepotism. It's not because of that they are somehow, just forcing themselves up there. The way to force themselves up there is through nepotism. They allow for their future, generation to take up those positions and positions of power. And that happens usually in the collective nature of a society.
And I'm sure, I don't have studies on this, but I'm sure it could be shown that nepotism leads to the degrading of all kinds of social institutions, because you don't get the same quality that you otherwise would get. And it honestly, I think it's one of the reasons, I think there's probably studies on this, why the American military is the strongest, still, may not always be still, the strongest military force in the globe, is because so many other countries, especially in the Middle East, relied on nepotism for how people moved up in the ranks of the military. So it was your nephew who got the commission to be the lieutenant or the officer, or your next blood relative.
You don't get a free society where nepotism happens, right? There is no way. So why does it go against biblical notion of who we are? I think the very fact that we are made in the image of God, the very fundamental thing about us, or property about us, that we are creative. Every individual, regardless of where we are creative beings. And how can we actually have a system where we allow for nepotism on the basis of blood relations, that we can actually encourage that feature of creativity among people? That wouldn't happen. If we're creating a system where creativity have to emerge among all people, then we have to have a free society where people have opportunities and people have everything available for them to aspire on the basis of creativity, not on the basis of the opportunity itself, not on the basis of some benefits, but on the basis of the creativity, which may look different among all people. We won't be at the same level. And how does that work out in a society would determine how we flourish together.
Well, and that's, this was kind of one of Willie James Jennings' critique in his book After Whiteness as well, where he gives these personal accounts of people that he interviewed for jobs coming into Yale as looking for faculty positions, and they were white. And he talks about how he's sort of repulsed at the fact that they're so kind of qualified, that their emphasis is so much on their credentials and their qualifications. And he kind of feels a sort of revulsion at this is part of whiteness, is this meritocracy. This is too where it's like it becomes difficult. I mean, I think of like the church that I'm in, talking about a pastoral issue. If our critical race theorist colleagues are correct, so here I am, a white guy in an all, I guess I'd call it brown church, right, Jacob? You're familiar with my church. And I'm one of maybe there's one other white guy, but all of the people I engage with there are brown, I suppose. And I'm teaching them C.S. Lewis. And I would fear that C.S. Lewis's take on Christianity is imbued with whiteness. Maybe not completely, because he certainly had a critique of Enlightenment thinkers. He critiques Immanuel Kant straight off the bat in The Way to Glory. So he's on the right track on some things. But, I'm sure Lewis has aspects of what these critical race theorists would call whiteness. Should I be teaching or using C.S. Lewis when I teach young brown bodies who also have minds, right? I mean, now I'm in a pastoral dilemma, right? And when I listened to Roberto Romero talk about the analogy of the melting pot, the salad bowl, and the salad bar, so maybe I shouldn't be serving in that context because I don't have the lived experience of Mexican Americans, even though I grew up with Mexican Americans my whole life on the south side of Chicago. But I'm not one. I'm an Italian American, if anything, and that's third generation. But if I don't understand them properly, now how would one understand them properly unless you just hang out with them? I don't know. But, you know, and this is where it's like, you know, the idea is like, we don't feel like we're a melting pot anymore, you know, in America, where we can come together and just have an exchange of goods, right? You know, and then the other analogy was the salad, you know, like, well, maybe we're not like a melting pot where we all become one, but we're a salad where you got the tomatoes, you got the different things in there, but at least we're in the same bowl. But now it almost feels like we're more of a salad bar where we're all like in our little containers. So I think this,
and my point is that there might be these different containers, but there is no bar to put them together as well. There's nothing that's bringing all these. There's no unity
that holds the containers together. They're all
exactly
scattered around on the floor.
And that's where we've arrived at.
Now, of course, I don't, at some point I say to myself, I just don't give a crap what some of these CRT people say. I'm going to serve my church the way I'm going to serve my church. But, you know, I mean, if one was to start thinking about this, oh my goodness, should I be teaching C.S. Lewis or not? I think that's it's a question on the table. You know, maybe we got to take Lewis and Tolkien and some of these guys. We got to cancel them. You know, Dr. Seuss style, get rid of them. You know.
Well, there's a few things I want to say because Tony, you brought up quite a bit here. The first one is that panel discussion. They almost chalk it all up to the Enlightenment basically poisoned the well, and I think one of the things they either ignore or they don't ironically take into consideration is how the Enlightenment thinkers thought of themselves. And a lot of what they're doing, if you read, for example, Montesquieu or Locke or even Plato, I did this interview with Dr. Guerra, where we trace the concept of power dynamics and how do you establish true forms of government and what happens. Or Rousseau, you see these same questions coming up, like, do you have a transcendent value? And if you do, how do you build governments on that? What kinds of things are people prone to? Why are they prone to that? I mean, the debate between Rousseau and Montesquieu, not maybe directly, but in their works,
right?
You have Rousseau talking about the collective, about the voice of the people. And then you have someone like Montesquieu saying you have to divide the powers up in governments because they will become extremely abusive and usurpacious. But they're not talking about race and class and, you know, the idea that these ideas of power are inherent in a particular people group. It's, well, power is abusive in governments. It seems like every form of government goes abusive. So maybe if we break apart the crown essentially into legislative bodies, this is why the United States is having a 3-part government, is that keeping power away from decentralizing power has a way of responding to the abuses of power. And I think first of the CRT, I think, misses that. The second point, though, is this unity question. And this goes to something that I think I really agreed with in the David French interview with Barry Corey, but I think is not, there's something to say about the panel interview and how I think they're going to disagree with this. David French quotes, I think it's Micah 4:4, where he talks about, you know, we need to get back to a particular place in our society in which people are living under their tree, attending to their own vines. Like, this is a very conservative principle. You could go to Roger Scruton, you can go back to Edmund Burke with the idea of that's Tocqueville when he's talking about how the American system kind of builds up from the family. This is why Locke talks about private property. You know, you need a way in which the individual can express their creative power, and it seems like that is in part due to ownership. You can connect that back to Genesis with the idea of tending to the earth. There has to be some sort of creative possession that happens. But what I don't What I think David French underestimates, though, and something that I think the CRT advocates are going to have problems with, and I think some of the quotes that they state are indicative of that, is the shift from my tree, my vineyard to our tree, our vineyard, and then making it a gospel issue. That if you're actually in the my tree, my fig, my fig tree, my vine camp, you're actually no longer dealing with the gospel. That's a very fundamental divide. I think David French often underestimates how valuable that distinction is in allowing even Micah 4:4 to kind of spring up as something that's relevant, something that we should hold on to.
Yeah.
Well, that's a good point. And
again, that connects with the very idea we were talking about, the whole idea of creativity as being made by God, uniquely made by God, that we all must have that freedom and possibility of being ourselves and creating and being under that vine, right? Just not being infringed by someone else.
Yeah, like the idea of like once you shift over from like our property and our tree,
Yeah.
you lose. They'll usually say, well, it's for the distribution of of wealth. It's more equal society, but what you lose out on that is the individual creativity. No one can say this is my house and I get to make of it what I think is best. The right to pursue happiness, right? This is coming from Locke, the private property. Why we have certain views is because it seems like people tend to flourish best when they're the caretakers. I was reading this study. It was super interesting, and I've seen it replicated elsewhere with my friends. But something very simple, like with COVID, we haven't done this for a while, but in the office, right, with cups, the sink always fills up with used cups. But the moment they say, here's your cup, or what cup do you want, and they get to buy their cup, you give them a little money, here's like $10, $15, buy your cup, that cup stays clean. It's their cup. They're not going to like fall apart. It's just a very simple example when you extend property rights. But again, a product of the Enlightenment thinking, it seems like there's something interesting about property rights, that when you give someone something that they can take care of, and they have to fall under the consequences of their own care, they tend to do well.
That's a good point. And before we start wrapping up here, I'll say about, maybe what some of the CRT advocates are picking up on that is maybe a real sociological fact. And it's a fact because in virtue of technology, it is the sense that we don't have good, strong, small communities anymore. We've become such a technocratic nation. People move around so much that there really is just an innate sense that we've lost the local community. Logan and I, you mentioned Viktor Frankl a few episodes back about the need for friends. And, maybe in a sort of reactionary way, there might be some impulse to use CRT as a way to refocus our hearts and minds to the community, because people feel like they're individual islands floating off on their own. And especially now with COVID and a year of a lot of isolation, there might be something to said for it. I think we would just want to say we don't need CRT as a tool to refocus us on the need for strong bonds in small communities. Authentic friendships was, when I went up to Oregon and gave that panel discussion on this, that was basically my answer, right? Is how do you want to overcome racism or disparities in authentic friendships? Will tend to answer, I think, most of those issues, and stable marriages, right? So anyways, we started off, just to wrap it up, with pointing out some inconsistencies between one CCCU podcast, which was the interview between Barry Corey and David French, where Barry Corey said that CRT was fundamentally antithetical to the gospel, and David French was saying he thought CCCU has been doing, by and large, a very good job of having open dialogue and debate and allowing for disagreement. I think we've shown, or we've argued at least, that unfortunately it looks like those CCCU members who are advocating CRT feel very differently than Dr. Corey and David French do. That obviously they're arguing that CRT is fundamentally compatible with the gospel and should be used to evangelize, and also that they have not been given a fair hearing among CCCU colleges and universities. So we did want to surface that, hopefully in a charitable fashion, but also with some substance in our critique of some of the CRT views. But we'll leave it at that. And in our next episode, I think we'll go a little bit more into some of Dr. Cartagena's writing in specific. So thank you guys, and we'll see you next time.